Are going to get started as we're waiting for a few more people to log on. And just from the technical standpoint, if you can make sure you're muted when you come on, unless you're going to talk, that'll help everybody with the background noise. Let me go to the agenda slide, please. So today we're going to go over a few things that specifically we're going to ground in where we are in the time of our world right now. We're going to unpack the SDI toolkit that was released on Monday from the department and what are the 4 sections of that. And we're going to have some time for some open sharing from some districts and ESD providers on what's happening, what's going well, where are still struggles and problem solving. And then we'll open it up for questions on the toolkit. I want to start with this slide and helping everybody remember the context of where we're at. And a reminder that whether you've been a special ed leader for 2 days or 2 decades, that our work has always been to speak for those without a voice and to stand in inequities in the gap for our students. And that this time is not different. This quote was shared with me yesterday, and I thought it was really grounding in that we are strong, we know what we know, and we see what we see, and we're strong in what we want. And we have always been ready to take charge and to interrupt the inequities of our system. I also want to share a few things. This morning we have a management team meeting with Colt Gill and the other leadership folks at ODE. Some areas of concern that we are working on and dealing with, I think, will add context when we think about our work in front of us. This pandemic has had a varied effect on our communities of color. I want to highlight this before we start to remind us that this is heart work. This is a national health emergency, and people are dying. Privilege that we sit in, that we can even consider talking about the technical components of compliance while we are in the middle of this pandemic should be matched with our deep compassion and understanding of those that we work to serve. Among the hardest hit groups right now are our Latinx community. We've seen reports where they're struggling with shelter, food, work, healthcare. Community leaders are calling out the needs and demands for resources and support from elected officials. Our Black African American community has named a clear lack of people of color making decisions on COVID-19. So people in skin like mine and white skin are making decisions for everybody. Deep impacts today also on our 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. Colt reminded us that disease is a part of the genocide of Native Americans. And right now it continues for tribes across the country. People are dying and there are tribes facing extinction right now due to this crisis. Burns Paiute and Warm Springs are in desperate and challenging situations. Businesses are shut down, and for many of the tribes, the primary economic resource of casinos have been closed. People are out of work and government services are closed and facing shutdown. There is no relief from the federal CARES money. That money is directed to government and school officials, not tribes and tribal nations. This leaves them each to scramble. I want to hold that at the front as we plan this, because when we say at the department, we want you to focus on care, connection, on relationships, we have students and families that are there, that are in these groups that are struggling, that we need to think about that first and foremost before we think about all of the components of an IEP that we are so accustomed to thinking about, that we're so trained and patterned to believe that we need to have all of the check marks, everything done. This has to first be hard work. And so I'm going to implore you to really, really lean into that with your teams, with your school teams, to think about all of this work in context of where your students are and where your families are. And that first, they need to know that you care. They need to know that there's a relationship, and above all else, that we are here to support them, and that education can be the pillar to support families in need when nobody else can. Next slide. So we'll start into the Distance Learning for All toolkit. When you open this first, the very first part you will find is a page you can share with your case managers. And this was designed as kind of a one-pager of the whole toolkit. So you can see on the left side, 4 steps. If everybody's stuck and doesn't know where to get started, this would be a great place. Review the guidelines for the Distance Learning for All special education guidance that was released a few weeks ago. If you can, implement the IEP as written. Then no amendments are necessary, no adjustments. You can lean into instruction, think about supports, and start to move forward. If the SDI needs to be adjusted, consider using the template that we're going to talk about. And if parents disagree with proposed changes, schedule an IEP meeting. The full instructional day includes both the teacher-led, the supplemental learning, and the nutrition and wellness buckets. All 3 of those are critical and important as we plan for the learning of specially designed instruction. And that mirrors what happens in our school days when we think about SDI as well beyond one-to-one teacher instruction. Questions that we're asking you to consider and your school teams to consider when planning for SDI. Can the student goals be met in distance learning for all? What are the LRE options? What will that look like right now? Can it be taught by both gen ed and special education in partnership? How can you leverage the assets of the student and the family when planning activities? Next slide, please. The toolkit is broken into 4 sections. The very first section is really the framing values and understanding distance learning for all in context of the gen ed. So when we look at this, we know that our public education system was designed for students who have ability and not those who experience a disability. We know that we already have disparate outcomes, and we know that our students who experience disability suffer from a range of factors and experience outcomes that are far different. And special education teams and teachers have worked for decades to overcome this and to prove over and over that students who experience disability can and should succeed in our schools. This time is no different. This time we are overcoming this, and we are proving over and over again that our students are amazing and they have assets and gifts far beyond what the typical person may see. And our job is to highlight that and shine that on. Next slide, please. The guidelines for distance learning include social, emotional, mental health, partnering with families and caregivers, instructional time, and equity and access. And this includes a component of UDL, and this is in the general education guidelines. Yesterday, Colt shared with superintendents across the state. This is the information. Dawn from Beaverton, the superintendent, shared, this is a perfect time to lean in and think about learning in a new way we never have, and how to include all of our students in new possible ways in general education. We've also said UDL is not something you have to be a master at, and this is not a special education initiative. If you are just starting and your teams have never heard it, it is a perfect place to begin to say, what could this be? Not that it has to be up and running and perfect. And everybody's in different quadrants of that, but where you are is where you are, and you want to start moving. Next slide, please. The other components in the guidelines have operational and administrative logistics, as well as teacher learning time. And this includes the 3 buckets of learning. Also shared with superintendents yesterday were that we are expanding what you would think of in that teacher-led time to include the supplemental buckets and the nutrition and wellness time, just like we do when students are sitting with us in school. That all of those can be teaching times and often should be instructional time that we can capture and support learning. Released a couple weeks ago was the special education guidance. These were the 6 steps that outlined where a team should start. So I'll point you to number 2, review the IEP in context of distance learning. To the maximum extent possible, implement the IEP. So really what we're looking at for the SDI toolkit, it's kind of living within 2 and 3 as you review the IEP. Again, placement can be considered, but this is not a change of placement. Every student in Oregon is experiencing this change, and that was not a decision made by a district or by an IEP team. Districts should examine the effect of closure on student progress towards their IEP goals and review the guidance of tracking goals during the closure. One of the tables in here in that guidance released 2 weeks ago. If during the closure, the team determines that the needs of the components of the IEP cannot be met as written, then the team must work to convene either into a written agreement, amend the IEP, and look at the goals, the SDI, and the services, all the things that are impacted by the closure, and work with the family to make a new plan. The second section of this toolkit is to review the IEPs. And so in this, what you would start with is thinking about the student's unique disability, their unique assets, and what do they bring to this. For many of our students who experience a disability, this closure is the first time in their educational history that they'll be included to the same extent as their peers without disabilities. I would encourage you to use this as an opportunity to think creatively and boldly, to share as Dawn did with the other superintendents. This is an opportunity for every student to hear all of the instruction from the gen ed teacher first, and then we can support more. That's an amazing, amazing mindset and shift and asset that our students can have during this time. Part of the review of SDI is looking at your service summary, thinking about the type in alignment with your goals, your minutes based on the unique needs of the learner. Location and provider, the department is recommending not to change. Location, regardless if you had special education classroom, general education classroom, SLP room, wherever you had it, it doesn't matter because the context is shifted for you. And so all learners are now located in the same space. And so we would recommend not making this change right now because it's not an IEP team decision or a district decision to move location. And the same with the provider, either LEA or ESD, you would keep the same. If you had something different there, you might need to consider it, but have been LEA or ESD. Things for the team to consider as you're reviewing the SDIs, or if your case managers are working with you through this, you would consider, what were you in the process of teaching before schools went to extended closure? What activities did you have planned? What standards were you in the process of covering? Were there in-task schedules, task analysis, first then, choice boards, all the things that we create and we capture that you can share with the home, that you can send home, that you can mail, and that you can then support the family with using. And then what goals are no longer relevant? What maybe is impacted during distance learning for all that is not going to be necessary right now or not applicable, or is getting in the way, or is not the first and primary goal that we should be working on given the new context. I've added the quote down here. I think it's really important that we recognize the U.S. Department of Education has issued this in their March statement. It's important to emphasize that federal disability law allows for flexibility in determining how to meet the needs of students with disabilities. That there is not a one-size mechanism or plan or support for designing and creating instructional supports for our students. And that word flexibility is in there on purpose. And so we should be giving ourselves grace and a lot of opportunity to lean into that and think of creative new ways to provide instruction in this new context. When we think about the minutes of SDI, teams should consider the full context of distance learning for all. While it's true the department has recommended maximum teacher-led learning, that shouldn't comprise the whole learning day, and that teacher-led learning will be bolstered by other parts of the learning, the 3 buckets, the supplemental activities and the nutrition and wellness needs. Earlier on a call, Autumn from Dallas shared all of the things that they were planning in supplemental learning time before we went to distance learning is a perfect example of what they're going to employ during this to add to their teacher-led learning time. She said, we already did the work there, so now we're going to capture that, bring that in, and add that to what we're doing. So it's not a loss that we're just going to start compiling and growing the work that we've been building. And remembering that the minutes of SDI could mirror the school day. When students receive SDI during recess, peer interactions, lunchtimes, that's all important learning context based off of the needs of the learner. SDI was never intended to be one-on-one teacher direct instruction. Therefore, it's not limited to just the teacher-led bucket. We gave you some examples in this toolkit, and these are not, they're not have-tos and they're not to-dos. They are ways and opportunities for a school team to look at a sample and think, okay, how would this work, or what's my context? And it should be a starting place if your team is stuck and they don't know where to go next. I will also say that some considerable conversation we've had around creating a situation where we have SDI where a parent is doing a read aloud and we're calling that SDI. And there's a lot of conversation we've had. And what I will share is that the department is issuing this as guidance. And that means you have considerable coverage as a district if your family and your parent are engaged in that in partnership with you. And so use that to the maximum flexibility you can, knowing the department is issuing the guidance. Next slide, please. When you think about SDI, note that this represents a different take on how districts could choose to implement the IEP. And what we showed you before with parents providing supports under the guidance of special education is not how we would do SDI when students are in our schoolhouse. But we're not in our schoolhouse. Our students are sitting at home. They're sitting with their providers and caregivers. So our context is incredibly different. And so I'm going to ask you and encourage you to think about multiple ways that this can happen and be achieved, and that there is no one way that's going to work for a family or for a district. We strongly encourage innovation and iteration in this process. First, we ask you to focus on care and relationships, thinking about the connection of our students and families. When I shared with you earlier today, the students who are experiencing varied outcomes and a deeper impact, connect with them and where they are. And then lastly in the toolkit is compliance. And it's last on purpose, because that should be the last part of our thinking as a school team. Each student is going to experience this closure differently. And our first job is to provide care and connection, and then focus on instruction. Also included in the toolkit are some activities that are designed, they're taken from the Ohio Center, thinking about multiple ways that transition functional skills activities can be embedded in the home. These are things we normally take out of our focus classrooms, out of our separate spaces, and thinking about how those can be mirrored and mimicked for SDI in really creative and challenging ways, but it absolutely engages the family in new and complex learning needs that can be wonderful for students. There's some ideas on dancing, music, puppet shows. We've seen some examples already where students are using communication devices to partner in their classrooms with the typical third grade students who are all sharing their story and read aloud. And the student with a communication device is sharing that as well. Next slide, please. So this section, the third section of the toolkit, this is where we get into the technical components of amending an IEP. And so there's one piece of new information and two things that are going to be very typical and familiar to you. So first, teams do not need to complete, both steps 3A and 3B in the toolkit. You can choose one or another option, or the full IEP. And so I would say also the department is going to be releasing further information for districts on identifying, tracking, and planning for the small percentage of students who likely are going to need extended school year or some form of comp ed. And this is probably going to be for students who can't access general education options, students who were previously in segregated classes, and whose goals and services can't be met at this time. That doesn't mean that they're not receiving some service and some supplemental education, but it's truly not meeting the intent of the IEP. And so we do believe there's a small percentage of students that this is going to be true for. And I've shared in previous webinars, we have 2 funding supports that we are generating for this. One is a non-competitive grant that the department will be issuing to recoup the cost in that. And so districts don't need to absorb that directly. And the second will be for an extended summer bridge program to support learning as soon as we can open some opportunities back up. And on here, and we will add in the chat, Mary's email. If you're interested in being part of the group to support this effort, we're looking for some deep stakeholder engagement and feedback. Like this toolkit. This toolkit had 15 different school districts' eyes on it, a few attorneys that were willing to spend time over this weekend working feverishly over a holiday weekend trying to get guidance out. And so in the same vein, we're looking for a lot of feedback and support from our partners to issue this out. So the first step you can do if you're in that situation where you're with a student and a team and the team's saying, we can't meet the needs right now, what are the steps we need to take? So one of 3 options you have. The first is to, like any time during the cycle of an IEP, amend the components of an IEP. This can include, not limited to, goals, SDI, services, placement. And during the closure, when the team evaluates it, if you're making a change, you can communicate with the parents, write a prior written notice, and then use the written agreement process outlined to do that. There's not a requirement to change anything in a state level reporting system. So we're not asking that you change anything that is in your student information system. If you're using like a Synergy or a TyNet, that you wouldn't need to document the change in that, but you would clearly need to document it in a meeting note or in a message to the family. The biggest thing, I would make sure that you are updating and communicating with the family so everybody understands what does the change represent and what does that look like right now. The second option you have is to use a new form the department completed. This is a 4-page form. It's called the emergency. So we released this on Monday, and this is in partnership with several other state education agencies as an opportunity, as a way. What we're hoping for is that this form can be used in lieu of amending the IEP, writing a written agreement, and then in the fall or when we come back, having to amend again. And so imagine this form is going to sit in partnership with your IEP. So your IEP is in existence and in place, and this form becomes a supplement to it. So you don't have to have a bridge IEP or an interim IEP, that this form really can live for that purpose. Some notes about this form. It can only be used during the emergency closure under the governor's executive order of schools. And it must include partnership and consent of the parent to be used as an adjustment to the IEP. Next slide, please. This form should be completed with the distance learning plan for all in mind. And for each section of that form, the change that you're initiating should be clearly communicated to the families. This document's intended as a communication tool between the IEP team and the family to share, here are the changes because of this emergency situation we're living in, not because we don't believe this is appropriate or right when student is back in our school, but for this time, this is the change we're proposing and what makes sense. This doesn't need to be a complete rewrite of the IEP, but rather it's an indication of where changes are made. For sections that will not change, you could simply say, no changes, see attached IEP, or something similar. Your third option, as always, is to hold an IEP meeting. And this would be appropriate if you cannot implement the IEP as written, nor can you use a contingency plan or a written agreement that you would want to hold and convene a full IEP meeting. Where teams determine it necessary to hold an IEP meeting, the department would like to remind you of the many options that you have to hold it over the phone or virtually to enact the governor's stay home, stay put order, and that you can use to the maximum extent possible the provisions of IDEA for excusal when attendance not necessary. The last section I will say is our sample plans. This is not a must do or to do. This is really when you get through the first couple sections and you've thought about it, this is where if your team says, I don't know what that will look like for these students. And I will also say the department has really deep gratitude for the school districts, both Central and Beaverton, who were willing to share and submit their plans over the weekend with us and work in partnership with us. It is not easy to be the first and to be vulnerable in public like that, and both of them have been gracious and willing to step up in that way. And so we have deep appreciation for that. The Central School District Plan, you can see here, it's a student who has significant minutes per week of SDI, and how they would break that up. And for Central, what their superintendent shared yesterday with all the other superintendents was, and this will be a shift because this is going to ask the gen ed teacher to pick up SDI before, and they haven't done that in a deep way. And there's some new learning to happen to make that work, but we're all going to do it in partnership. And so this has prompted some new conversations and some new patterns of being for the school district. Next slide, please. We'll also share, we have Beaverton's plan submitted here. One of the areas I really appreciate is the I do, we do, you do model. Districts can look at that. That is really a familiar way of being that we know when we teach. We recognize that, our case managers and our teachers see that and appreciate that. And so as you think about SDI around the context of all the different learning options, this is a really, really great opportunity. One of the parts of Danielle's plan I think is really critical and unique is the what is SDI and what is it not. And I'll orient you down to the left side where it says what is SDI. And if you scroll to instruction provided by the general education teacher, paraeducator, or parent under the supervision and direction of special education. I think this is an area where the context is critically important, right? That it can be your paraeducators working with a student, it can be your gen ed, it can be your case managers, your special ed teachers, under the guidance and direction, right? And it's not parent or guardian direct instruction. So they're not curating, creating, and designing the specially designed instruction for that to work. And so again, really big gratitude. And if you are stuck or your team doesn't know where to start, there are some great options. There's also a sample IEP in there, and step by step how to take and break apart this toolkit and go through with some thinking of what could this possibly look like in the context of a school district that had not moved to inclusion, that did not have UDL in place, and really at what would they start with and how would they plan. So at this time, I am going to open this up and ask for some of our colleagues to share. Danielle, I know that you are on the line and I've already shared a little bit of Beaverton's plan. I'm wondering if you are willing to unmute yourself and start with a share. What's going well? How have you leaded forward during this? And then what are you still looking for?
Okay. Hi, everyone. So Candace pretty much shared, we tried to think about how we were going to approach the situation in a way that we didn't have to amend 5,000 IEPs. And we did, originally we started looking at a proportionate share, and then as of Friday shifted kind of our thought about what SDI needs to look like. And so in a lot of other districts, we know that SDI looks like push-in support and other things, but in Beaverton, we are primarily a pull-out support. So when we were thinking proportionate share, we were really thinking about direct teacher instruction, specialist instruction. So we had to like shift that mindset and then adjusted and kind of said, okay, well, we're going to really think about, okay, we need to give guidance to our service providers about how much time do they need to focus on teacher-led service provider direct instruction provided by them, because they needed a gauge like their gen ed colleagues had. So we really looked at kind of, okay, how much direct instruction will they be providing and what would that look like? And so then we kind of laid out that direct instruction from them might look like pre-recorded videos, it might be live Zooms, it might be phone calls, and really thinking about that piece there. The other part from them that falls into there is that consultation piece where they're consulting with a paraeducator or a parent who will then provide additional instruction to the student based on packets we send home, online webinar type or online virtual activities like iReady or other tools that we have students using. And the more I wrapped my head around it, I thought, well, that's kind of what we do anyways in instruction. We don't usually have the parent involved, but if I think about a student who's going into the resource room or even students who are in our specialized programs, a lot of times the teacher leads with direct instruction, and then there's a practice that happens, which is either is usually supervised or implemented by a paraeducator. And so the teacher is then, watching over it, the special ed teacher, but they're not giving the direct instruction. And so once we kind of shifted that mindset, it kind of gave us a lot of relief to say, okay, so how are we going to provide or meet all these minutes, knowing that not all of those minutes are going to be provided by the specialist through direct instruction, but it's going to be a combination of looking at that service provider led direct support, consultation with the general ed teacher. So when that student is participating in general education, what kind of things that teacher can pull out and focus on. It's going to be consultation with the parent to go over any materials we're sending home so that that student can independently practice or practice with the help of their parent. And then the same with our paraeducators. And so when we started kind of putting all of that together, really we were like, okay, our teachers are going to have this amount of time that they are directly interacting with kids. And then we're going to send packets home, or we're going to send links to virtual things, and the students will get the other 60 minutes in that alternative way. Is that good, Candace?
Thank you, Danielle, that was wonderful. Thank you. And again, I think for the field and for the department, like your work this weekend and your willingness to publicly share your thinking and where this was going with your teams, there's deep for that leadership.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And you all hang in there. We're in this together. So.
Also I believe I have on a call, I have Carol Byron from LeGrand. Carol, are you my number with no name? Okay, we may not have Carol. If she comes back on, we will add her. Lisa McConaughey, you and I had a couple messages, and you had a couple great ideas of how you were thinking outside the box and improving services. Are you willing to share some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of along the lines with what Danielle was saying, I would echo, I think this is a really great opportunity for us to leverage and strengthen our educational partnerships. So for example, working with students in Beaverton where they're sending home some packets, we're coming alongside them and sending home the packets in Braille. For students, we have in the regional program some pretty complex students with a lot of minutes on their IEPs. And thinking creatively in terms of sending home a document camera and a webcam or a web camera to the family so we can be on a Zoom call and then also watch the child's fingers so we can see the placement on the Braille. We're sending home curriculum. Today we pulled together a statewide meeting of our orientation mobility specialists to talk about that type of service. Talking about ways that we can virtually support teaching children travel in the community. So people are partnering with parents to go on virtual walks in the park to talk about landmarks and clues, partnering with parents during mealtime preparation, and again, leveraging a lot of that supplemental material that was gathered initially. There are some incredible opportunities for families to download accessibility features on their own computers, on district computers, and then to kind of learn alongside their students how to use and access those materials. So I would say it is a bit daunting and it's been a bit exhausting, but I think there's also some really good outcomes that are coming out of this that I think probably will improve some of our services even going forward. So, yeah.
Lisa, thank you very much for sharing. Mary, can you go to the next slide? So I have my final slide on here. We'll go back to it. You can see it. The final slide is around hope, that we are living in a space and a pandemic that is greater than any of us anticipated, and it's difficult. And in the face of that, we have to have certainty, and that comes from the hope that we transform. I've asked Anne O'Connell to share a little of her hope as we go forward. I will share with you all very publicly. And when I was a very, very brand new special ed director, Anne was a beacon of light and a guidepost for me. And so I knew that when I called on her to ask, like, what is hopeful right now, that she would have a well of it. And so, thank you, Anne.
Wow, that is wonderful to hear. I have to really appreciate Candace in terms of providing some hope. I loved how you started today's session. Sometimes it's easy to lose kind of the focus on the impact on our kids and our families, beyond kind of our own personal impact. And in special ed, we love concreteness, we love structure, we love our forms and predictability. We're good at that stuff. And this whole era has been such a challenge, and part of it has been a lack of clarity. It's kind of come to focus over time. We think we have a handle on it, and then it changes. And I have to say, Candace Pelt, you've helped to give us some hope. You're in a terribly difficult position, but we need you. And you've been gracious and out front, and I know it hasn't been easy. Listening today and kind of sitting back and hearing some of the examples of what this can look like. I'm a former life skills teacher, and I loved that job because everything about it, life was an opportunity to teach with kids who have significant cognitive disabilities. This is a great opportunity like that was. Burden isn't the right word. The responsibility of trying to implement an IEP in a meaningful way has been a challenge for a special educator to do. And at times it feels like we're doing it alone. This process is opening that up. The responsibility to implement an IEP is now shared with Gen Ed in a way we've never done it before. Or maybe other people have, and I haven't been as successful at doing it that way. We're involving parents and caregivers to the maximum extent they can. They're getting an inside perspective on their child's disability and ways and strategies that they can support their child. How wonderful, and involving our instructional assistants in this process, again, in a much more meaningful way than we have in the past. And I don't know about others, but sometimes when I've reread IEPs that I have written in a hurry, I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't even know what that goal means. Now we're having to look at those things, and I bet our IEPs are going to be better as a result of this. So really, it is daunting, but there is hope for a pretty big change for our field. So thank you.
And it was beautiful as anticipated. Thank you. Deep appreciation. And for, again, the entire field, we had 15 districts, 2 attorneys review this. People spent their time. Elizabeth Pole, I see you're on. I'm going to call you out. She spent, over an hour reviewing the SDI toolkit in her professional capacity with me. Deep just gratitude for that. I think that our work is always going to be better the more we're in it together. And so, everybody that has touched into this and has provided options and opportunities and resources, pointed out in there, Eric will add a website link on here. for the open sharing resource website that we've been generating for all educators, and special ed is not without need in that. And so definitely use that, access it, find service and resource. So thank you everybody for taking the journey on from where we started and setting our tone to some hope and ending in that spot. At this time, we'll open to some questions. If you have technical questions about this or other support areas, feel free either to unmute yourself or to put it in the chat.
Hey, Candace, this is Landon Braden from LeGrand.
Hi, Landon.
Hi, Carol was texting me. She's having some problems unmuting her phone.
Okay.
But asked me just to say a couple of things.
I would love that, Landon. So yeah, I reached out to Carol. You guys have a really special superintendent who has been in deep partnership and has leaned in with critical support and been a really strong voice for superintendents. And so I'd love for you to share some thinking for people.
So, I mean, I hear a lot of echoes of some similar thoughts. One of the things that we jumped on early was the first version of the distance learning and the packet program. And we were poised pretty well to jump from that to expanding the actual learning opportunities. Because much like most of you, we're educators, and we do this for a reason, and it's because we love working with kids. And one of the biggest struggles that our special ed staff had was, so to speak, somebody moved to their cheese. Mm-hmm. In that it's not ideal. It's not, best case scenario. It's not what they signed up for. So kind of taking that and considering that the general ed setting has changed. And what does that mean for us as special ed support staff? So once we were able to kind of put into context that the target has changed a little bit, which means we need to respond and our roles need to change a little bit. And how do we support that, what's going on in the gen ed setting? And so we have a lot of partnerships built in place with our special ed teachers and gen ed teachers doing the kind of co-teaching, supporting our families. We have focused on getting internet out to folks that maybe didn't have internet, which I'll tell you, I never would have thought that would be something that would be in short supply, but those things are hard to find right now, those hotspot devices. And so we were able to locate about 75 of those that should be here tomorrow. And then we'll work with our local care organizations and YIT coordinator to really pinpoint which families would need those, and then develop some infographics to help them use that technology. But one of our other focuses has really been, of course, the students, of course, the families, but really being cognizant of staff burnout and really being cognizant of passion fatigue. And so Carol and I have really used kind of beefed up our communication using technology and apps, and really trying to build some camaraderie and facilitate some communication and some positive uplifting things within our staff with videos and doing shout outs to each other via Marco Polo or whatever it might be, just to kind of keep some positivity and let them know that we're here for them. We're here to support them just like they're there to support their kids.
Landon, that was really wonderful. Thank you for sharing what's happening in LeGrand. Yeah, and I appreciate the passion fatigue and the compassion fatigue, right? That, many of our, especially what Anne was sharing about being a life skills teacher and thinking about those teachers who are holding right deep in their hearts all the students that they were closest with and to every day, and how they, the angst that they're going through. And so thank you for reminding us of that.
Absolutely.
Candace, can you guys hear me now?
We can.
Hey, I pulled over at Farewell Bend. I'm between Boise and Baker, I guess. Now I'm in Farewell Bend. Thank you. I apologize. And Landon couldn't have said it better. He is going to take my director's position next fall when the real craziness is going to start. Candace, as I was listening to you, I wanted to thank you for what you said right at the start about how we're here for the kids and how we're really all about the kids. And I do have an awesome superintendent who is working with us. I couldn't have said it better than Landon. So we've just worked together as a team. I have an A+ special ed team out there working right now, and if they think they have to do something, they do it. We go to homes if we have to and knock on doors. I personally delivered a bunch of packets the other day, which was really fun and quite an eye-opener for me, to say the least. So, yeah, thank you, you guys. And we're all in this together, all the way from Idaho, where I just came, back into Oregon. So, yeah, thank you. And I apologize for missing out on that.
No worries. Thank you so much, Carol. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute or to add it to the chat.
Candace, this is Saf Evans.
Hi, Saf.
Hi, Philomath area. I was wondering about your slides. Are we going to get a copy of your slides, or?
Yeah, the slides and all of these have been recorded, so you can pick which one you want to see. All 4 of them today will be recorded and on, so you can hear if my stories change over the day or my tone of voice. But the slides and those, they're all going to be on the Special Education COVID site.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, with that, we will leave the chat open for a few more minutes in case people have questions, but we will end early. I hope that you leave today with a deep sense of hope, of commitment, that we're here with you. We are partners with you. If you need support, the department will be there with you. We are leaning in and supporting in multiple ways, in multiple meetings, sitting with special ed directors sometimes in staff meetings. If you need something and you feel isolated and alone, I would encourage you to reach out, to lean in, and we creatively and together will find ways to support you, because we've got this, and Oregon education can be and will be amazing through this. Thank you, everybody.